You're hot.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We are getting some new data this morning out of the North Carolina Department of Instruction, that's NCDPI, about crime in public schools across the state. According to DPI, public school crime dropped 7.7% during the 23-24 school year compared to the year previous. Again, according to that new data. The report presented to the State Board of Education back just last week also highlighted the lowest high school dropout rate in the past decade at just under 2%. So some big-time improvements there as well. Ninth graders accounted for the highest percentage of dropouts at 33% overall, not 33% of ninth graders. Out of the 2% of total dropouts, 33% of them were from ninth grade. During the 23-24 school year, 77% of North Carolina public schools reported 0 to 5 acts of school violence. According to the state superintendent of public instruction, the newly elected Superintendent Mo Green, he said in a statement, quote, "While crime and acts of violence in schools are always unacceptable and hinder the learning and growth of students, I'm optimistic that reductions in the crime rate, the rate of violence, and dropouts in high school reflect positive change." Dr. Michael Mayfer, the Chief Accountability Officer for DPI, added, quote, "The way classrooms operated in 2018-2019, let alone 10 years ago to now, is vastly different given the use of technology and other factors. While crime and violence in schools is never what we want, it is promising to see the rates have dropped this year. But the overall picture is not without some concerning trends. Though there was a reduction from the previous year, the report acts of crime and violence are still 9.3% higher than they were in the 21-22 school year. Incidents involving assault on school personnel and bomb threats increased, even as other major categories such as possession of weapons declined. Long-term suspension rates increased slightly from where they were at 49.09 per 100,000 students in the 22-23 school year to just over 48.0 in the 23-24 school year. Additionally, the rate of in-school and short-term suspensions rose by almost 3% over that same calendar year. The newly released report comes against a backdrop of highlighted concerns about school safety and discipline following COVID-19, as previously reported over at carolinajournal.com, where there were worsening trends in suspensions and school crime during the 22-23 school year. The DPI report released in January of last year showed that public schools reported 13,000 acts of crime and violence. It's an 18% jump from where those numbers were right during the COVID-19, right before the COVID-19 pandemic. You can read some additional details and check out some more quotes this morning on that story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:09. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. The state of North Carolina has one of the most lengthy early voting periods throughout the United States of America. Some new legislation introduced in the General Assembly looks to change that. To get some details this morning, Brianna Kramer, carolinajournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Brianna, it goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks ahead of the November election. You've got some details on some new legislation out of Raleigh this morning. What are the details there?
Yes, that's right, Nick. The span of early voting in North Carolina could be limited to just a week ahead of Election Day if a new proposal makes some headway in the state legislature this session. So a new bill was filed last week in the General Assembly, and it seeks to reduce the state's early voting period by more than half. So as you just mentioned, we've become accustomed to early voting going on for nearly a month in North Carolina. But this bill, which is sponsored by Representative Wyatt Gable, it would change that. It would shorten the early voting period from 17 days to just 8 days, beginning on the second Monday before Election Day and ending at 3 p.m. on the last Saturday before the election. And so this past year in the 2024 election, voting began on October 17th. But under the new proposal, that would have actually been pushed back to start on October 28th.
Well, and when you look at the way that North Carolina does their elections, each county, all 100 of them, are responsible for their own elections. All the boards there are responsible for early voting. Brianna, running 3 or 4+ weeks of early voting comes at serious expense to the taxpayer locally because it's your local county that's funding this, not the General Assembly.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one thing that Dr. Andy Jackson at the John Locke Foundation pointed out, is that reducing the number of early voting days would actually help reduce financial and personnel burdens on every county election board. So there definitely would be some benefits. However, at the same time, you don't want to reduce it too much, or you may have to require counties to open more sites, for instance, at least partially negating the advantage of reducing the number of days. Dr. Andy Jackson suggests that a sweet spot is really between 7 to 10 days of early voting before Election Day. So that's right where this bill would line up.
Well, and it's interesting as you looked at, and we talked about some of this early voting data you and I did before the November election. A lot of people take advantage. More than half of the people that actually voted in the November election last year, Brianna, voted early. And I presume to say because they had 3+ weeks to do it, why bother voting on Election Day? So maybe some changes coming there.
Yeah, that's right. And when it comes to voter turnout, reducing the number of early voting days by more than half will not reduce early voting turnout by more than half. So that's something that might have been raised as a concern. But according to a 2019 academic report on early voting in North Carolina, there is little evidence that suggests early voting changes would have some sort of uniform effect on the impact of who is showing up early. But it's interesting because some people may assume that early voting favors Democrats, but recent elections show that that's actually not the case, or at least anymore. In North Carolina, Donald Trump won 51% of the early vote in the 2024 election in North Carolina, and that compares to 48% for Kamala Harris. So registered Republicans were 34% of all North Carolina early voters in 2024 compared to 32% for Democrats. So, obviously voter turnout is something that we'd have to keep in mind in, considering any kind of change, as well as, the financial benefits or, potential risks when it comes to personnel and different, struggles or benefits this may have on county election board. But it's something that is now up in the General Assembly, and we'll see where it goes this legislative session.
Well, and you talk about the expense and the personnel costs for the County Board of Elections. I can only imagine for the candidates, Brianna, running. I mean, you've got races from dog catcher to president on the ballot every 4 years. All of those campaigns have staff, family, friends, people that are standing out and working those early voting locations. You're talking about hundreds, thousands of hours if they're dispersed across the state worth of volunteer hours as well. It's a major strain on campaigns.
That's right. It's a big time commitment, major time commitment, far ahead of Election Day. And it's something that we've heard a lot more talk about, possibly even like in other states and at the national level, just more people talking about how it's time to get back to Election Day, or at least in this instance, limiting it down to about a week beforehand for the financial benefits, as well as for security purposes as well.
Where can folks read more details this morning?
Go to carolinajournal.com and you can read the latest there.
Brianna Kramer joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic this morning, an update with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you.
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Don't forget that you can watch the show streaming live each and every morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. You can also take the show with you on demand on your own time by downloading the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the show, subscribe, and follow, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. We are continuing to track details, as we have now for many months, about the high-stakes race for North Carolina Supreme Court. And the news and update this morning is that Jefferson Griffin, the Republican candidate, has filed notice of appeal in all three lawsuits concerning his challenge of more than 65,000 ballots cast in his election against Democrat Allison Riggs. Those appeals to the North Carolina Court of Appeals arrived 3 days after a Wake County Superior Court judge and William Pittman rejected three different categories of ballot challenges that Griffin was pursuing. Pittman issued his ruling Friday afternoon, hours after holding a hearing attended by Griffin and Riggs. A one-page order in each case upheld the State Board of Elections' December decision, rejecting those different groups of ballots that were set to be protests. Now, there was some questions as to how this process was going to unfold, whether Griffin was going to immediately appeal this to the state's highest court, meaning the North Carolina Supreme Court, where it was originally, or if he would work up the ladder to the Court of Appeals, which he has decided to do. Depending on the ruling in the Court of Appeals, we might see this once again elevated to the North Carolina Supreme Court. So we still likely have at least a couple of weeks left in this saga for the state's highest court. As I mentioned yesterday morning, the Republicans currently outnumber Democrats 5-2 on the state's highest court. A Riggs victory would not lead to any change in the partisan split. However, a win for Griffin would boost the Republican majority to 6-1. It's something that we continue to track and follow. We'll keep an eye on the appeal, let you know as soon as we get a schedule when things are going to be heard coming up here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:23. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. You may or may not be aware of the largest industry in the state of North Carolina. It's not technology, it's agriculture. The farming industry booms across the state of North Carolina, and it's a pleasure to be joined this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour by Katie Zender at carolinajournal.com about an outlook for the 2025 agricultural season. Katie, big business across the state of North Carolina. What are you learning this morning?
Hi, good morning, Nick. Yeah, so agriculture brings in more than $111 billion in the state of North Carolina. And last week, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services held their annual State of Ag Day with addresses from different people, including, Commissioner Steve Troxler, with some different, outlooks concerning what is agriculture going to look like in North Carolina this year. And so one of the speakers they hosted was also at last year's forum. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Dorfman, and he is a professor at NC State University, and he is also a former economist with the state of Georgia. So this guy, he's been in agriculture and in the economy for a long time. He knows what he's talking about. And he gave his annual address on the economic outlook for agriculture in 2025. And so basically the bottom line he's saying is that it's going to be kind of a fair to midland kind of year for agriculture. It's going to be a little bit different than last year. And that last year he said, we're not going to see prices come down. The big difference between 2024 and 2025 is prices aren't going to be coming down in 2025, but at least they're not going back up. So prices are going to stabilize in 2025, and that's kind of the bottom line for what we're looking at in agriculture in 2025.
Obviously, when we're looking at agriculture, one of the things that's on the top of individuals' minds is the prices that they see at the grocery store, whether it be fresh fruits and vegetables or various other products that are on the shelves. So as you're reporting this morning, maybe not to see those things dip immediately, but at least they won't be going up any further.
Right, exactly. So Dr. Dorfman said, it's going to be a good year for growing tobacco, and it's going to be a good year for raising animals. Not so much a good year for some other crops, corn, soybeans, some of the other primary crops here in North Carolina. One thing that has not changed from last year is while inflation isn't coming down, the only way that North Carolina families are keeping up with inflation is because they're taking on multiple jobs. So, one income families are becoming two income families are maybe taking on, more jobs. So really that's the only way that North Carolina families are keeping up with the inflation, whether it's, going up or whether it's kind of staying the same. They're only doing that because they're taking on more work.
What else did you learn from the presentation that was hosted by NC State in regards to agriculture?
Right. So one of the major things that Dr. Dorfman pointed out was that during the last few years, prices have been changing so rapidly that farmers haven't been able to even figure out what to set their costs at in order to, not only offset their production costs, but actually make money. So as prices stabilize this year, it's going to give farmers a chance to actually catch their breath and determine what do we need to sell our products and our crops at so that we can not only cover our production crops, but actually make money.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up. One of the things that's often not often discussed in regards to especially small to medium sized farms are all of the input costs, Katie, whether it be the diesel fuel that runs the equipment, the rising price of fertilizer, and other things that are needed to produce those fresh crops each and every year. Those prices, well noted from the doctor, fluctuating rapidly, and that is a huge issue for these small to medium sized farms where, Katie, if we're being honest, the margin is not very big for these individuals even to start with.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Nick. And, diesel and fertilizer costs are some of the biggest costs that farmers face. And he did indicate that we're going to be seeing those costs come down a little bit in 2025, not a ton, but they will be coming down somewhat. He also said, farmers this year need to be able to make money, or at least hand on at the current price range, or for their commodities to be successful. Also, something that he indicated that is one of the biggest ways to indicate and kind of keep a gauge on how agriculture is doing is paying attention to John Deere, the infamous tractor and agriculture equipment company. And he said, if you pay attention to them and what they're doing and what they're saying about agriculture, that's a really big indicator of how the industry as a whole is doing, not just in North Carolina, but across the nation. Every quarter they hold a day where they talk to their investors about how business is going. And if John Deere says business is going great, then agriculture is probably doing great. That's not what John Deere said this year. So, the John Deere Tractor Company is based out of Moline, Illinois. Their sales are down 20 to 25% this year, and they really haven't had any. Yeah, they're huge, almost a quarter down in sales, and they haven't had anything good really to say about 2025. So that kind of confirms his prediction that 2025 will be, kind of a fair to middling year. And he started off his speech by saying, for some people, this might be an improvement over 2024 because, things are looking a little better than 2024. At least we're not seeing prices go up. They may not be coming down, but at least we're not seeing them go up. But yeah, so it's going to be kind of, a stabilization year for farmers. This also means that they're not really going to be in the mood to buy, a $1 million piece of equipment. And so when John Deere says things are looking up, that's going to be sort of a sign that we got to make the money first because they need the money before they can go and buy the equipment. But the primary outlook for this year is let's just get through 2025. He said, this is one of the most, striking quotes from his speech. He said, the reality is farmers right now are just trying to survive and hang on until a better year.
Yeah, and obviously they've been through a lot of tough stuff over the last couple of years with pricing, with inflation. Katie, you've got some more details this morning, including a couple of pictures from that meeting. Where can folks get those details?
Right. They can see all the details, read the full report, and look at the charts at carolinajournal.com.
A great update this morning. Katie Zender from carolinajournal.com joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic on this Tuesday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:35. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Looking at some news on Twitter overnight. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has officially renamed Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg. That, of course, the large military base that we've got in the Fayetteville area across North Carolina. Video posted to X in the overnight hours shows the Secretary and Hegseth signing the order, which officially named Fort Liberty from Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg. And with that, this morning, soldiers from the 118th Airborne Corps at Fort Liberty are set to be there's about 1,500 of them that are set to deploy to the southern border to help with the suppression of illegal immigration. A U.S. official confirmed the report to the Associated Press late last week, speaking on a condition of anonymity because the deployment was not publicly announced. That would eventually bring the total to about 3,600 active duty troops at the border, with more than 1,500 of them coming from the newly named Fort Bragg. At the end of January, defense officials confirmed to military.com that the 82nd Airborne Division and the 3rd Brigade combat team out of Fort Bragg had been prepared for mobilization since mid-January, as had elements with Fort Drum, New York's based 10th Mountain Division. Troops going to the border are expected to help put various parts of border security in place, including wire barriers in place, providing transportation, intelligence, and other support to the U.S. and Customs border protection. Securing the border, as you are well aware, has been a major campaign promise and was a major campaign promise for President Donald Trump, reiterated in his inauguration speech. And on his first day in office, the president declared a national emergency at the U.S. southern border. There will also be several hundred Marines stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where some of the detained migrants will be held. Problems from illegal immigration have ranged from gangs out of various parts of Mexico and Venezuela taking over apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado, to the murder of individuals throughout the country. It has been a major issue in the United States, and here in North Carolina, the drug trade continues to be an issue. North Carolina ranks number 6th in total drug overdose deaths in the country, according to 2022 statistics from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Wilmington City Councilman Luke Waddell said during a roundtable discussion that took place back last year that his city overdose rate outpaces the national average. So the border security, border crime continues to be a major issue, and some folks from North Carolina at the newly named Fort Bragg are already on their way or have already made their way to the border. We'll keep an eye on that over at carolinajournal.com. Well, yesterday it was the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, who was in Haywood County to survey Hurricane Helene damage and recovery efforts along I-40 near the Tennessee line. He was joined by Democrat Governor Josh Stein, Senators Tom Tillis and Ted Budd, alongside Representatives Chuck Edwards and Tim Moore. Duffy told Fox News that much of the section of I-40 between North Carolina and Tennessee had been completely washed away. He said that that stretch of the roadway is such an important artery that, quote, connects people and commerce not just between the states, but across the country. He estimated that it would cost billions of dollars to rebuild, and a lot of rock would be needed to fill back the eroded interstate. Stein confirmed on his X page that 2 lanes of I-40 in Haywood County will partially reopen on March 1st, so coming up here in just a couple of weeks. And he said that it would be reduced speed two-way traffic and would remain a construction zone, advising drivers to remain cautious. During the visit, Duffy announced a partnership between the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Forest Service that will grant a special use permit for extracting rock and other construction materials from Forest Service land and nearby rivers. Duffy, speaking exclusively to Fox News yesterday, said, quote, "We can get rock 30 or 40 miles away. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money, but the Forest Service can partner with us, and we think they're really close, just about a mile or a mile and a half over this mountain. We can get access to rock that will drive down the cost and the time frame for which it will take to rebuild this road." Duffy added that they are looking to build quickly, cheaply, and safely, noting that the Trump administration moves lightning quick, unlike the speed of previous administrations. Speaking of the president, he previously visited Asheville and the Swannanoa area last month. He called FEMA a disaster and called for a possible elimination, criticizing the federal agency's slow response to recovery efforts after Helene. Trump proposed that states should take over disaster recovery operations directly, hinting at a major shift in how federal disaster aid is handled currently. While in Swannanoa on Saturday, U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said less than 20 days after Trump's visit, the 47th president secured over $54 million for families in need and registered some 2,600 families for assistance programs who had not yet received any assistance. This was just Saturday when she was in Western North Carolina, Kristi Noem. She also said that in the past 5 days, they have decreased the number of open cases by almost 80%. 80% in just the last couple of days. Noem told Fox News, quote, President Trump is ensuring that communities aren't forgotten. She added that he also launched the first major initiative to connect farmers with recovery assistance as well. Some other comments coming in from lawmakers, including U.S. Senator Ted Budd, who spoke yesterday and said, quote, I'm grateful for this opportunity to welcome Sean Duffy to the I-40 washout site in Haywood County. It's critical that we get this section repaired and reopened as soon as possible. So continuing to watch those recovery and relief efforts out of Western North Carolina. We have seen a huge emphasis from this administration on getting various pieces of infrastructure, whether we're talking about individuals' homes, farms, private businesses, or property, to major interstates like Interstate 40, a huge emphasis for this current administration. And of course, we have seen the president visit and other officials within his cabinet, Sean Duffy, Kristi Noem, and others. It continues to be a major priority for them. We'll keep an eye on those details as those folks continue to visit, and of course, as those relief and recovery efforts continue over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:43. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We will get an update on traffic on this Tuesday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:49. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of the morning show, you can head on over to your favorite podcast app, search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap the subscribe and follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Recapping one of our stories this morning as we continue to track details out of the race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin has filed notice of appeal yesterday in all three lawsuits connected to his challenge of more than 65,000 ballots cast in his election against Democrat Allison Riggs. Those appeals to the North Carolina Court of Appeals arrived just a couple of days after a Wake County Superior Court judge in William Pittman rejected 3 different categories of ballot challenges that Griffin was pursuing. Pittman issued his ruling Friday afternoon, hours after holding a hearing attended by Griffin and Riggs. One-page orders in each case upheld the State Board of Elections' December decision, rejecting 3 different groups of ballot challenges. Riggs leads Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots cast statewide in that election, which ended all the way back on November the 5th. A temporary stay is currently in effect from the North Carolina Supreme Court that blocks the State Board of Elections from certifying Riggs as the winner. This appeal, we will be tracking the details on that, the timeline. As soon as we expect any arguments to take place, we will pass those details along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The span of early voting in North Carolina could be limited to just a week ahead of Election Day if a new proposed law makes headway in the state legislature this session. A new bill filed last week in the North Carolina General Assembly seeks to reduce the state's early voting period by more than half. The bill is sponsored by Representative Wyatt Gable of Onslow County, who is the youngest member ever elected to the North Carolina General Assembly at just 22 years old. The bill would shorten the early voting period from where it currently stands at 17 days to just 8 days, beginning on the second Monday before Election Day and ending at 3 p.m. on the last Saturday before the election itself. For reference, in the recent 2024 election, early voting began all the way back on October the 17th, but the new proposal would have pushed that date back till October the 28th. Dr. Andy Jackson, who's no stranger of the show, the director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity, said, quote, "Reducing the number of early voting days would help reduce financial and personnel burdens on the county election boards. However, reducing them too much may require counties to open more sites, at least partially negating the advantage of reducing the number of days. My own research suggests that the sweet spot of between 7 and 10 days of early voting might be ideal. When it comes to voter turnout, reducing the number of early voting days by more than half will not reduce early voting turnout by that same amount." Jackson further explained because most voters will choose to vote on other days. According to a 2019 report on early voting in North Carolina, the report reads, quote, "There is little evidence that changes to early opportunities in North Carolina had uniform effects on voter turnout. Despite common assumptions that early voting favors Democrats, recent elections show that early voting opportunities benefit both parties pretty handedly." Jackson said, while politicians on both sides believe that early voting benefit the left, that is no longer the case. For example, Donald Trump won 51% of the early vote in the 2024 election in North Carolina, compared to 48% for Kamala Harris. Registered Republicans were 34% of all North Carolina early votes cast in 2024, the general election in November, compared to 32% for Democrats. So some changes, potentially some changes coming to this. We will track House Bill 66 here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. As soon as we get any additional details, we will, of course, pass it along to you right here. The economic forecast for 2025 suggests stabilizing in agriculture prices, according to Dr. Jeffrey Doferman, an agricultural and resource economics professor at NC State. He spoke at the North Carolina Agriculture Development Forum last week, and Doferman described 2025 to be fair to middling in regards to easing input costs but declining commodity prices, particularly for crops. Tobacco and livestock producers are expected to fare better than other farmers. While inflation has slowed and prices are not expected to decrease, allowing farmers to better assess production costs and set profitable prices, however, economic strain remains as families continue to take on additional jobs to keep up with record sky-high inflation. Weak sales in agricultural equipment sector, including a 20 to 25% drop at John Deere, indicate cautious spending amongst farmers. Dorfman emphasized strategic marketing, urging farmers to sell when prices peak rather than maximizing production. He also recommended using forward contracting and futures markets to secure favorable rates, stressing that profitability should take the precedent over volume in 2025. So again, looking at some of the details from this event that happened last week, Doferman said, "I'd like to give you good news, but fair to middling 2025 is sort of where I'm at. For some of you, that would be an improvement of 2024. So fair to middling might be fine with some of you and starting a good trend. But I think what we're seeing is input costs have eased, but commodity prices have been sort of falling down, particularly for crops. It's a good year to grow tobacco and raise animals. It's not a good year for some other crops, but we're going to get rid of some of those cost pressures, and that should help." So those were some of his comments at the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Agricultural Development Forum, which took place late last week. You can read some more quotes from him and check out some additional pictures and details by visiting our website this morning at carolinajournal.com. And recapping some other news this morning, soldiers from the 18th Airborne Corps at the newly named Fort Bragg are said to be among the nearly 1,500 active duty soldiers that the Pentagon is set to deploy at the southern border to help with the suppression of illegal immigration. A U.S. official confirmed the report to the Associated Press on Friday, speaking on the condition of anonymity because the deployment was not publicly announced. That would eventually bring the total to about 3,600 active duty troops at the border. At the end of January, defense officials confirmed to military.com that the 82nd Airborne, as well as other teams out of Fort Bragg, had been preparing for mobilization since the middle of January. That would coincide with President Donald Trump's inauguration, as had elements at Fort Drum, New York. That's the 10th Mountain Division. Troops are going to the border that they are expected to help put up various pieces of security in place, including wire barriers, and provide needed transportation, intelligence, and other support that is needed by the U.S. Border Patrol and U.S. Borders and Custom Protection. So you can check that out and read those additional details again this morning over at our website, carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.